What do you remember of Jacinda Ardern in the early days when you first came there?
I didn't have a heck of a lot to do with her in the early days. Probably best memories are just a diligent worker. She stuck to her portfolios, very earnest, friendly, but not someone that was overly considered, I don't think, in Wellington here, leadership material. Auckland talked about it a lot. Our Auckland colleagues talked about it a lot. She ruled it out herself so many times, I think, as well. I remember her doing I think it was a Women's Weekly article saying that she was too anxious to hold the top job, that she would find it quite intimidating because of her own struggles with the anxiety that she felt in herself. And I wonder whether that possibly played into people's thoughts here that, you know, she didn't want it. Obviously, when the time comes, everyone wants it, right?
I mean, that's why you're in Parliament, right? But early on in 2017, it all changed because a seat opened up in Mount Albert in Auckland when David Shearer left.
We had got a bit of a tip-off that David Shearer might be looking at standing down before he did. And Paddy sent me to stake out Jacinda Ardern heading into a select committee to see whether she would tell us whether she was going to run for Mount Albert if David Shearer stood down from it. I think she slammed the door in my face, actually. She didn't want to answer. She did a runner from me. And it wasn't long after that Shearer stood down and she put her hat in the ring, and that trajectory was just enormous. So within a matter of weeks of her winning that by-election, she became the deputy leader.
And when did you first see Jacindamania? Was it after her deputy leadership, or was it after her leadership when she became the leader?
I think that the proper Jacindamania stuff happened when she became the leader. So there was a little bit of hype around her, particularly around those young audiences and younger voters. The term youthquake kind of started coming to the fore around Jacinda Ardern. In that first election campaign in 2017, she did a lot of visits to university campuses and places where young people were. And I think that was where the real hype was in that 2017 election for Jacinda Ardern, was among young people.
And she became leader in August the 1st. It was a Tuesday. What do you remember about that time and that day?
That was a crazy week. A crazy, crazy week. We were in Auckland the day before, I think, and we had a News Hub poll that night. And I went to speak to Jacinda Ardern as part of that coverage and asked her whether Andrew Little was staying on. And she must have known at that point what was going on behind the scenes, but it wasn't until the next day. And they all rolled up here at Parliament and bang.
It all kicked off.
It was all on, yeah.
What do you remember feeling when you saw her as leader for the first time?
I think the press gallery was quite taken aback. Particularly some of the more senior members of the press gallery was kind of taken aback by how well she did in that press conference. She was really strong. I remember, some of the more senior members like questioning her quite hard as to whether she was up to that job. She was taking over the leadership, I think it was 6 weeks out from an election. So there were some pretty legitimate questions being thrown at her as to whether she was, A, she wanted to do that, and B, whether she was up to it. And she handled it with aplomb. She did an incredible press conference. And that was probably one of the first times we saw Jacinda Ardern, the kind of communicator in chief. She held the presence of a room in a way that possibly people had written her off a little bit before. Yeah, very good press conference.
Do you think National was worried that with Ardern going, oh heck, she's the one who could do this?
Yeah, they were worried. They went into attack mode. There were a couple of things that Jacinda Ardern did during that campaign that probably set her on the wrong path. which was the rolling in, rolling out of the capital gains tax, couldn't quite figure out where she wanted to sit on that. She put it back on the table, made a captain's call to put it back on the table. Stephen Joyce whipped up the attack ads, and I think it was a matter of like 3 days before they dropped that policy again. I remember Jerry Brownlee bringing down a pair of cheerleading pom-poms to hand to Patrick Gower because he thought that we were going too soft on Jacinda Ardern. So you could definitely see some panic stations happening in the National Party.
And no one won it. They had to go to coalition negotiations. Did you, in your gut, think that he was going to go with Jacinda?
Again, that was really hard to pick. It was all happening within basically one room in Parliament. So Winston Peters held court in this one room, which was kind of neutral territory between where Labour were in this building that we're in right now, Parliament House, and where National were still in the Beehive because they hadn't handed over the reins of government. And we would just sit and watch Winston go up to the room from Bowen House, and then we'd have a spy looking out to see if Labour were going to see him or whether National were going to see him over this kind of like open air bridge that you could see going into that room. So there was a little bit more activity around this place. And near the end of it, I think we did see him meeting with Labour a little bit more than National. But no one knew who he was going to go with. He didn't even tell Labour that he was going with them until he came down for that press conference. And if we thought it was excruciating, like, I can't imagine what the politicians were feeling on either side, because he held their future in his hands and just didn't tell anyone. The country found out at the same time as Jacinda found out that she was going to be the Prime Minister, and Bill found out that he wasn't. That's wild.
Did you have any idea that she was pregnant?
No, I don't. And I would never ask a woman that. But she did have to answer that question. Do you remember?
That's right, she did.
Mark Richardson on the AM show asked her that question, whether she was thinking about having children. And the visceral reaction from women to that was, I think any woman that has worked in a workplace and had to think about, when they're going to take maternity leave and that kind of thing, this is on like a whole other extreme level. You're in charge of the country and have to take maternity leave, but the guilt that you feel for leaving your job to do a really important job, and the guilt you feel coming back after having a baby, I can't imagine what that was like for her.
It was kind of like New Zealand's royal baby in a way.
She brought her out and introduced her to New Zealand. But other than that, it was only quite rare occasions where Neve would accompany them to public events, because I guess they wanted to give her as normal childhood as they could.
She did in the United Nations General Assembly, that Leaders Week. That was huge. That went global with baby Neve. And
there were things like that Jacinda Ardern did that put New Zealand on a global stage in a way that was, I guess, quite organic, that other leaders couldn't necessarily do. There was so much global hype around her. Whenever you travelled with her, you would have been on heaps of trips with prime ministers, and it's not really often that the local media are that excited about New Zealand being there, apart from with her. Even going to those summits like the APEC summit or whatever, you'd always have, if she was walking past, you'd have international media like quite interested to take a look, which was I guess quite interesting coming from like little humble New Zealand. We don't really think of ourselves as someone to like look twice to see who's walking past.
What do you remember about March 15?
Horrific. She was in Taranaki, and we had a cameraman with her that day. She gave a brief press conference up there where, from memory, that's the first time that she said "they are us," and that in that moment it kind of just set the tone for how she set the tone for how the country could react to this. New Zealand was, a lot of people said we lost our innocence that day. We just didn't think that would ever happen here, right? But it wasn't, it was immense empathy, but there was also a decisiveness about how she was going to handle that crisis. The immediate looking at the gun laws, the immediate banning of the semi-automatic weapons used, everything happened really quickly in the aftermath of March 15. So yes, it was about empathy, but I think it was also about her decisive nature in that moment.
Is there any other leader that could have handled it the way that she did?
It's hard to say until someone's put in that situation. But there have been other terrorist events around the world that we haven't seen that same response. And it's hard to say whether that's again because of the public here as well and how they were feeling. Christchurch in particular, the public was, there were more flowers than anyone could ever count down there. People were like, the whole country was in a state of grief. And the Prime Minister could obviously feel that. And
then came COVID in January and February of 2020.
Yeah.
And everything changed, just another crisis to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
How did she deal with it at the beginning?
So the first case that we got in New Zealand, she was actually overseas. She was in Australia, and she was giving this press conference very close to 6 o'clock, very close to our deadline. And she said we had a case come into New Zealand. I think at that point, it had been very much, we might be protected by our proximity to the rest of the world feeling down here in New Zealand. Things escalated really, 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 really quickly.
In terms of what, like she was like, right, lockdowns, going to close the border, restrictions?
I think the first thing that happened was other people started closing their borders, so we needed to repatriate everyone back to New Zealand. Basically, Winston Peters, who was the foreign minister at the time, came out and said, get on the planes home now or shelter in place. Things are about to lock down. And I feel like it was just a matter of days, and every day just got more and more intense. She gave this Prime Minister's address from her beehive office, spoke down the barrel of a camera, and set out what would become the alert level system. Didn't put us into it right away. And then it was a few days before the cases started looking like we needed to lock down. And she came down and said, all right, we're going to go home, stay home for 4 weeks initially.
That was for the whole country?
Whole country.
Yeah.
Everyone stay home. They had a list of essential workers. The supermarket stayed open, but that was it, pretty much.
Yeah.
There was quite a lot of panic buying. There was quite a lot of panic. But again, and this is where the communicator in chief really took hold, because she became the only show in town. Everyone was at home, and every day there would be a 1 p.m. press conference, and everyone would turn on their televisions, and Jacinda Ardern and Ashley Bloomfield most of the time, the Director General of Health, would speak, and people would hang off their every word. And
the popularity of Ardern and her government showed in that general election in 2020 when they achieved the unthinkable.
A majority MMP government for the first time. The Jacindamania that existed in 2017 just could not compare. It was like a pop star had come to town. It was like Taylor Swift was in town. Everywhere that we went, and it, we were still supposed to be social distancing, I think, with masks on, and people were just mobbing her. And you know what it's like on election campaigns when you get kind of a media scrum around someone and you try and move. We were packed like sardines, and with cameras walking backwards, trying not to hit people, and mothers throwing their babies in to get photos with Jacinda Ardern.
So it was Jacinda Megamania.
It was Jacinda Megamania. And because of all of the reasons we've just said, because we did the lockdown and it worked, and we could see all of our friends and family overseas were having a not great time. And people thought of her as a saviour.
Then it quickly changed. I mean, when was the time that you noticed it flipped from that mega Jacindamania to people turning against her? Yeah,
I think by the time that Auckland lockdown rolled on, I don't think I could pinpoint a moment for you, but Auckland stayed locked down for like 3 months, the biggest city. And people just didn't feel like she had a plan to get out. The vaccines, as you say, we didn't have them as early as the rest of the world. They had a plan to, get us out of lockdown by using the vaccines, but that basically meant mandates, and that divided a lot of families, a lot of friend groups, a lot of the country.
And she got a lot of the blame for that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the country was behind those, the scanning in at restaurants and staying safe, and it was driven by I think a majority of the population, but for the minority of the population that really didn't want to do it, it cut really, really, really deep. And as I said, you'd have families or people were having weddings, and you were allowed 100 people if you were all vaccinated, but only like 10 if not. And so people were having to make some really big calls about really big events in their life, and people couldn't go to work at the place they wanted to work anymore. And there was a lot of fatigue with COVID setting in, and that's when the division probably started setting in too.
And it peaked at the beginning of 2022 with the protest and occupation and the riot that happened over 23 days out here. What would you call that group, though? Were they just a group of people united because they're disillusioned by the government?
Disaffected, I think, a lot of them, particularly the ones. And there was a lot of misinformation that was going around as well, and people were scared, and people were some of the behaviour out there was just awful. When they first turned up, there were nooses hung in the trees, and it was abusive, and people were saying that their school kids were being abused on the way to school for wearing a mask by these people. The business owners around Parliament were fed up with it. None of the politicians from in here wanted to go out and address it. So it just became, again, this divide. There was no way to talk through it.
We got to the tipping point as a country, I think. Was it just a case of overexposure and fatigue?
Possibly. I think a lot of lingering resentment around Auckland. Things started costing a lot of money all of a sudden. That's when inflation started really taking off. It took the government a really long time to recognise that and to take any responsibility for it. Because of the peak of popularity as well, if the crash is always so much harder if you're coming from a majority, that's an unsustainable in our MMP democracy, probably, right? So there was always going to be a bit of a spiral down, but I think as well, by that time they'd been in power for 5 years, and some of the things that they had promised. So all of these things had come up that we've talked about, right? But the Labour Party had also made a bunch of promises to New Zealand that just never happened, like 100,000 houses, like a train, light rail in Auckland, and they were trying to do a lot of things and none of it was really coming off, and it was all a bit fumbled. So while the rest of the world was looking at Jacinda Ardern and going, oh my goodness, there was a lot of back home, things cost too much, houses cost too much, you said you were going to fix it, you haven't fixed it, and we've been through a lot of pain, and we did all of the lockdowns, and why we're still facing pain. It didn't feel like there was a kind of a cohesive plan of what to do next as well. The failure to delivers were quite apparent in, like, we're looking back at 2018 sort of thing, and had the events that occurred not happen the way they did, then we wouldn't have been looking at a Jacinda Ardern majority government in 2020. I think the polling at the start of 2020 had them neck and neck, and it was going to be a race to the finish line, and Simon Bridges was running around doing press-ups at the big gay out, ready to go for it,
So COVID made her a bit, it broke her.
Totally.
Wow. Did you see a resignation coming?
No, I didn't. I think there had been some maybe question marks at the end of the previous year. So she stepped down in January. And around December, I mean, you always ask the Prime Minister this question, whether they're going to stay on for another term, right? And she'd been so adamant in all of these interviews, but there was kind of like an inkling of, oh, when is she going to go? But no, we went to Napier, and Labour and National were quite weirdly having their caucus away retreats both in Napier. So Amelia Wade and I both went up there, and she took National, and I spent the entire day pacing. Because normally we have kind of a bit of an inkling about what they're going to announce, right? There's usually a bit of it could be this. Everyone was kind of thinking, oh yeah, she might announce the election date. I was like screaming down the phone to her press sec, basically. Can you please tell me what's happening? This is weird. And I called the producers that were on that day, and I think I was basically like, oh, I don't know if I have a story tonight. Like, I don't know what this is going to be. I don't know if this is going to be that interesting. If she just says the election date, what do we say after that? And then she said the election date, And then she said, I've been reflecting. And then Amelia and I grabbed each other's knees because I remember John Key saying something similar in a press conference just downstairs. And I think I spoke about an audible gasp in the room, and I think it might have been mine. So no, I didn't see it coming.
There's still this underlying kind of stubborn hatred towards her. Do you notice that? When you go around the country and talk to people, do you still notice?
I think the language that was used toward Jacinda Ardern was quite different than any other politician. And politicians get a lot of abuse, and she got it by far the worst.
Why? Was it sexism?
I don't think she ever said that. She was always very, very careful not to label any of the things that she was getting as sexism. But I think there is a general consensus that definitely played into it.
Why has it endured?
I think there's just still a bit of grumpiness in the country as well. Things are still pretty tough out there. And people do like to find someone to blame for that. And potentially she just represents that period in people's lives where it was just really difficult.
Will history revere her?
She will go down as one of those that is most remembered. Like people will remember Jacinda Ardern in the history of New Zealand, I think.
Is there any way that you'd describe what that tenure was like? I mean, you had a front row seat to it right from the beginning and right to the end, literally, in many cases.
Just phenomenal. She was a very different sort of leader, in both good ways and not so great, right? But the period that she governed New Zealand through, basically from March 15 onward, that the country was kind of in this lurching from a permanent state of crisis to crisis. And it must be hard to govern through that for anyone. And no one will know who would have done things differently. But she certainly did it in a very memorable way.